Hey everyone, welcome to our channel. We're just getting started here, and if you're enjoying the spooky content, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us create more videos like this, and after you've watched, let us know what you think down in the comments. Let's dive into the horror. The year was 1862, and I, Eliza Hawthorne, found myself on a bleak, windswept path to Blackwood Manor, a place as remote as any hidden corner of the English moors. My family, though respectable, had fallen on hard times. My father's business failed, leaving us on the edge of ruin, and this position at the manor was my only chance to support them. But as I walked toward my new life, a strange unease settled over me, as if the manor itself had cast a shadow that reached out across the barren landscape, warning me away. The estate loomed ahead, tall and gray, its towers piercing the clouds like skeletal fingers. The manor's windows seemed to stare at me, cold and lifeless, as if they held secrets too dark for light to penetrate. I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me even as I crossed the threshold, a heaviness that had little to do with the thick autumn fog, and more to do with the quiet despair I sensed in its very stones. I was greeted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Brindle, a severe-looking woman with hollow eyes and a voice that echoed down the dim corridors like a whisper. She gave me a brief tour, pointing out the parts of the house I would be responsible for and quickly instructing me to stay out of the West Wing, under any circumstances. Her warning was final, though she offered no explanation. When I asked if the family used those rooms, she turned sharply to me with an expression so stern I dared not ask again. And yet, her answer, or lack thereof, filled me with a curiosity I couldn't shake. Why would a grand manor have a wing completely unused? Over the days that followed, I noticed strange things. Whispers in empty rooms, soft footfalls echoing down the hall at night, and shadows that flickered just beyond the edge of candlelight. Mrs. Brindle dismissed these things as old house noises, and advised me not to let my imagination get the best of me. But it was more than the groans of old timbers. I often had the distinct feeling I was being watched. Once, I turned quickly to catch sight of a figure at the end of a hall, a dark silhouette of a man, tall and still as a statue. I blinked, and he was gone. Lord and Lady Blackwood were peculiar in their own right. Lady Blackwood was rarely seen, hidden away due to some vague illness. On the rare occasions she appeared, her skin was pale as wax, her eyes sunken and distant. She would glide through the halls like a ghost, her eyes never meeting mine. Lord Blackwood, on the other hand, was a brooding, intense man with piercing eyes that seemed to look right through you. He moved with an air of solemn purpose, as though he carried a burden far heavier than anyone should have to bear. One evening, I was dusting the grand staircase when I heard Lady Blackwood crying softly from somewhere within the forbidden West Wing. Her sobs echoed down the corridor, full of despair and fear. I felt a pang of pity, and something else, a dark curiosity that pulled me toward the sound. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the West Wing, moving slowly down the shadowed hallway, following the soft wails. The walls here were different, colder somehow, and lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors who seemed to glare down at me with disapproval. Their eyes followed me as I moved, and I could almost swear I saw one of them, a tall man with deep-set eyes, narrowing his gaze as I passed. The crying led me to a large oak door, slightly ajar. Inside, the room was dark, save for a faint glimmer of moonlight seeping through the narrow window. I could just make out Lady Blackwood, seated in an old chair by the fireplace, her face buried in her hands. Her frail body shook with each sob. "My lady?" I whispered, stepping into the room, unsure if I should approach. She looked up, startled, and for a moment, her face was not her own. Her eyes, normally empty and listless, burned with terror. Her skin seemed almost translucent, and in the faint light, I could see the veins beneath, dark and twisted. She opened her mouth as if to scream, but no sound escaped. In that chilling silence, I heard a low, guttural growl. The sound seemed to come from the shadows in the corner of the room. I turned, heart pounding, but saw nothing but darkness. When I looked back, Lady Blackwood had slumped over, her face pale as death. I fled the room, feeling as though I'd narrowly escaped something I could not name. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were filled with visions of Blackwood Manor, the walls bleeding, the eyes of the portraits following me through endless corridors. In every dream, the shadow of a man loomed just out of sight, watching, waiting. The following day, Mrs. Brindle found me in the hallway and pulled me aside. "Did you go into the West Wing last night?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. I couldn't lie. "I did. I heard Lady Blackwood crying." Her face hardened. "The West Wing is forbidden for a reason," she hissed, clutching my arm with surprising strength. "Stay out of it if you value your life." Her words haunted me. I tried to follow her warning, but the pull of the West Wing gnawed at me, especially after I learned more about the manor's history. Some of the other servants spoke in hushed tones of Lord Blackwood's older brother, a man named Edmund, who had died under mysterious circumstances years ago. They said he was locked away in the West Wing, raving mad, until one night he vanished without a trace. Some believed his ghost still lingered there, bound to the manor by the violence of his end. Weeks passed, and the strange happenings only intensified. At night, I could hear the sound of a man's voice, sometimes murmuring, sometimes raging. Once, I found claw marks on the wooden floor just outside my door, deep scratches that hadn't been there the night before. One night, I awoke to find my candle flickering as if someone had just passed by. I opened my eyes, and there, standing at the foot of my bed, was a figure cloaked in shadow. His eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and his mouth twisted into a wicked smile. I was frozen in terror, unable to move or scream. He leaned down, whispering in a voice like gravel, "You don't belong here." Then he vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of decay. Driven nearly mad with fear, I resolved to leave Blackwood Manor. But as I packed my things, Lord Blackwood himself appeared in my room, his face grave. "Leaving so soon, Miss Hawthorne?" he asked, his voice calm, though his eyes held an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Yes, I can't stay here," I stammered, avoiding his gaze. He sighed, almost sadly. "I understand, but before you go, there is one thing I need to show you." Despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed him. He led me to the West Wing, to the very room where I'd seen Lady Blackwood. The room was empty now, but as we entered, I felt a presence, cold and suffocating. Lord Blackwood turned to me, his face pale. "My brother Edmund. He was never found, but his spirit, it lingers." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver locket, tarnished with age. He gave this to my wife before he disappeared. She was his one solace in this cursed place. Before I could respond, the door behind us slammed shut, and the shadows in the room deepened, twisting and contorting. From the darkness, a figure emerged. A man, tall and gaunt, his face twisted in rage. Edmund. Lord Blackwood backed away, leaving me frozen in the center of the room as Edmund's ghostly form approached. His eyes burned with hatred, and he reached out a hand, his fingers curling around my throat. I struggled, gasping, but his grip was like iron. Lord Blackwood tried to intervene, but Edmund merely laughed, a hollow, broken sound that echoed off the walls. "You trapped me here, brother," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "Now, I will take what you hold dear." As the life drained from me, my last sight was Lord Blackwood's horrified face, helpless to stop the vengeful spirit he had unleashed. And then, darkness. To this day, they say Blackwood Manor remains haunted, cursed by the spirits of those it has claimed. Some say if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can still hear my gasps echoing through the halls, a final, desperate plea from a soul forever trapped in the shadows. In the misty, desolate hills of England in the early 1800s, there stood an old, sprawling manor known as Blackwood House. The locals whispered tales of the strange family that had once lived there, a reclusive lineage, rumored to have dabbled in the dark arts. Generations of the Blackwood family had resided in the manor, each member more mysterious than the last, until they seemingly vanished without a trace. For decades, the manor remained vacant, its windows dark and its doors locked tight. Villagers avoided the property, warning newcomers to stay away. They claimed the place was cursed. One cold, fog-drenched night, a young scholar named Edward Fitzroy arrived in the village. He was fascinated by the occult and the supernatural, always seeking new stories and mysteries. Upon hearing tales of Blackwood House, his curiosity was immediately piqued. Ignoring the locals' warnings, he was determined to explore the abandoned manor and uncover the secrets hidden within. The night he set off to Blackwood House, the moon was barely a sliver, casting a dim light over the foggy path. The manor loomed before him like a beast of shadow and stone, its windows dark as empty eye sockets. Ivy crept up its walls, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the cold night air. Edward felt a shiver run down his spine, but he brushed it off, his curiosity overpowering any lingering fear. With a deep breath, he pushed open the rusty gate and made his way to the front door. To his surprise, the door creaked open as though it had been expecting him. Inside, the air was thick with dust and an unsettling dampness. His lantern cast flickering shadows on the walls, illuminating remnants of the manor's former grandeur. Grand portraits with eyes that seemed to follow him, a sweeping staircase draped in cobwebs, and ornate furniture left to rot. As Edward ventured deeper into the manor, he felt an unshakable sensation of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind seemed to carry a sinister undertone. But he pressed on, his pulse quickening with both fear and excitement. In one of the rooms, he discovered a small, dusty study filled with ancient books and strange artifacts. The centerpiece of the room was a large, blackened mirror with intricate carvings around the frame. Edward approached it, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the object. As he gazed into the mirror, a strange sensation washed over him, as though something was stirring within its depths. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the reflection, a tall, shadowy man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. Edward spun around, but there was no one there. His heart raced, but he couldn't tear himself away from the mirror. It was as if it held him captive, drawing him deeper and deeper. The figure in the mirror began to move, its mouth forming silent words that Edward couldn't understand. Desperate to decipher the message, he leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. That's when he saw it. The face of the figure wasn't human. Its eyes were empty, its skin stretched and decayed, and its mouth stretched into a grin that seemed to widen as Edward watched. Panicked, he tried to pull away, but his body was frozen. The figure's bony hand reached out from within the mirror, stretching and contorting until it touched the glass. A bone-chilling cold seeped into the room, and Edward's lantern flickered, then went out, plunging him into darkness. In the silence, he heard a whisper, so faint it was barely audible. "Join us." Edward's breath quickened as he tried to break free from the mirror's grip. But as he struggled, he felt an icy grip tighten around his wrist, pulling him closer to the glass. Shadows coiled around his body, seeping into his skin, leaving him numb and paralyzed. He managed a scream, but it came out as nothing more than a strangled gasp. The whispering grew louder, filling the room with an eerie chant that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Just as he felt himself being drawn fully into the mirror, he broke free from the trance and stumbled backward, gasping for air. He ran out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the manor. But the whispers followed him, relentless, growing louder with each step. He raced down the winding staircase and reached the front door, only to find it locked, as if the house itself had trapped him. Desperate, he pounded on the door, screaming for help, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. In his terror, He remembered the library he'd seen earlier, where there had been an old fire poker. He sprinted back through the dark halls, his breathing ragged, and found the poker. Using all his strength, he smashed the front door open and fled into the night. As he ran down the hill toward the village, he glanced back only once. In the broken doorway, the shadowy figure from the mirror watched him, its hollow eyes gleaming with malice. A cold dread settled over him, but he dared not slow down. However, by the time Edward reached the village, he was staggering, weak, and shivering with a cold that had seeped into his bones. Villagers found him collapsed in the square, muttering incoherently about shadows, mirrors, and whispers. He tried to warn them, to tell them of the curse, but his voice grew faint, and his vision blurred. Within hours, Edward had fallen deathly ill, his skin pale and his eyes hollow. He passed away before dawn, his final breath escaping as a faint whisper, repeating the words that had haunted him. The villagers buried him near Blackwood House, marking his grave with a simple stone. But on foggy, moonless nights, they say you can still see a faint light in the manor window and hear Edward's voice echoing on the wind, as if trapped forever, calling out from beyond. "Join us! Join us!" In the autumn of 1843, a young couple, Eliza and Thomas, ventured to the English countryside to escape the noise and bustle of London. Thomas, a budding painter, had heard of a grand but long-abandoned estate called Ashford Manor, nestled deep in the woods. He thought the isolation would be perfect for his art, and Eliza, enchanted by the idea of exploring old ruins, eagerly agreed to accompany him. The manor was magnificent, even in its decayed state. Tall, ivy-covered walls loomed over them, and shattered windows stared out like hollow eyes. A bitter chill lingered in the air, and Eliza felt an odd sense of dread as they entered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Ignoring her instincts, the couple settled in, making camp in one of the least damaged rooms. That night, as they unpacked, Thomas noticed an old portrait above the fireplace. A beautiful woman in a black dress, her eyes cold and piercing. Beneath the painting was a plaque that read, "Lady Isabel Ashford, 1780 to 1811. Thomas felt an unexplainable connection to the painting, and despite Eliza's misgivings, he decided to recreate it in his own style. But as he began to sketch, Thomas's personality seemed to change. He grew distant, muttering strange things under his breath. He was drawn to the manor's dark corridors, disappearing for hours without explanation. Eliza grew increasingly uneasy, especially after finding him one night, sketching furiously by candlelight with a haunted look in his eyes. She tried to persuade him to leave, but he refused, insisting he had to finish the portrait. One stormy evening, Eliza heard a voice, a faint whisper calling her name from somewhere deep within the manor. Following it, she found herself in the decrepit ballroom, where moonlight filtered through shattered windows. There she saw Thomas, standing before a large mirror, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. The reflection in the mirror showed him, but not her. Instead, there was a figure beside him, Lady Isabel, her skeletal hand resting possessively on his shoulder. Eliza screamed, breaking Thomas out of his trance. He stumbled back, the spell momentarily shattered. But as they turned to flee, a door slammed shut, and Lady Isabel's chilling laughter echoed through the manor. She spoke, her voice like ice. "He's mine." Desperate, Eliza remembered an old rhyme her grandmother had taught her about warding off spirits. She began to chant, clutching a locket her grandmother had given her. The air grew thick, and the ghostly figure of Lady Isabel seemed to waver, as if weakened by Eliza's words. With a final surge of courage, Eliza grabbed Thomas's hand and pulled him toward the front door. Lady Isabel shrieked, reaching out to drag him back, but her fingers passed through Eliza, who seemed to glow faintly as she shielded him. Eliza's love and her grandmother's charm protected her from the spirit's grasp, allowing her to lead Thomas safely outside. As they stumbled out into the cold night, Ashford Manor fell silent. the malevolent presence dissipated, leaving the couple shaken but alive. Thomas was forever haunted by fragments of memories he couldn't piece together, but Eliza was safe, her bond with him and the protective locket serving as her armor against the darkness. To this day, the manor remains untouched, with locals claiming that any man who dares enter alone will feel a strange compulsion to stay, while an unseen hand tries to pull him deeper into the cursed halls. In the heart of the Black Forest, hidden from prying eyes, stood the abandoned Liechtenstein Asylum. Built in the late 1800s, the asylum had once been a place where doctors experimented on their patients in the name of medical progress. During World War II, however, it became infamous for a darker purpose. Under the orders of the Nazis, it was transformed into a facility for twisted experiments on prisoners. When the war ended, the asylum was hastily abandoned, with officials claiming it had been destroyed. But the locals knew better. They could still see its crumbling silhouette through the trees, and they warned travelers to stay far away. In the early 1950s, a historian named Elias Wagner came to Liechtenstein. Drawn by rumors of lost records and mysterious disappearances, he wanted to uncover the dark secrets of the asylum's past. The villagers warned him, their voices laced with fear, but Elias was undeterred. To him, this was a chance to document history, to uncover what had truly happened behind the asylum's stone walls. On a gray autumn afternoon, Elias arrived at the asylum. The building was an eerie, crumbling structure, with broken windows and twisted ivy climbing up its walls. The air was thick and oppressive, filled with a silence that seemed to seep into his bones. As he walked up the overgrown path, he felt as if unseen eyes were watching him from the shadows. Dismissing his unease, he entered through the cracked wooden doors, their hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the asylum felt frozen in time. Dust blanketed the furniture, and medical instruments lay scattered as if the staff had left in a rush. Elias explored the patient rooms, their walls covered in scratch marks, remnants of the suffering that had once taken place there. He found patient files with disturbing notes about experimental surgeries and psychological torture. But as he read, he felt an unsettling chill, as if something was lurking just out of sight. On the second night, Elias awoke to faint whispers echoing through the empty halls. The voices were soft, almost like a chant, blending German and guttural groans of pain. Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped out of his makeshift camp in the former doctor's office. "Hello?" he called, but his voice sounded hollow in the darkness. The whispers faded, leaving only silence, but the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. The next day, Elias ventured into the lower levels of the asylum, where he discovered the remnants of a hidden laboratory. There were strange diagrams scrawled on the walls, symbols that seemed more occult than scientific. He found a journal that belonged to Dr. Weiss, the head doctor during the asylum's darkest days. The entries spoke of twisted experiments designed to trap the souls of the patients within the asylum, to create a captive army of the damned. The last entries grew frenzied, filled with warnings about the shadows that had started to roam the halls. As night fell, Elias felt a sense of dread growing within him, but he brushed it off, convinced it was just his imagination. He tried to sleep, but awoke again to the whispering voices, now louder and filled with sorrow and anger. As he listened, he realized the voices were calling his name, repeating it in an unholy chant. Shaken, he forced himself to investigate, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The whispers led him down a hallway he hadn't noticed before. It was dark, the walls lined with broken mirrors that distorted his reflection into twisted, nightmarish forms. As he walked, he felt a strange heaviness in the air, as if he were being drawn deeper into something far older and darker than he could comprehend. At the end of the hallway, he entered what seemed to be the main operating theater. But this room was different. The mirrors were intact, surrounding him on all sides. In the dim light of his flashlight, he saw faint figures in the mirrors, doctors, nurses, and patients, watching him with hollow eyes. Their faces were twisted in pain, their mouths moving in silent screams. Elias tried to turn and run, but he found himself rooted to the spot. He was forced to look as the ghosts began to step out of the mirrors, their eyes locked onto him, their cold hands reaching out. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly he was surrounded by them, their faces inches from his own, whispering in German, "Help us. Free us." He broke free, stumbling back down the corridor, but the asylum twisted around him, hallways stretching impossibly long and doors slamming shut before he could reach them. He was herded back to the entrance of the operating theater, where Dr. Weiss now stood, his ghostly form as solid as Elias himself. With a twisted grin, the doctor spoke in a rasping voice. "You've come to join us, Elias," just as the others did. Before Elias could react, he felt an unbearable cold seep into his bones. The ghosts surrounded him, pulling him down into the shadows, their whispers echoing in his mind. As they dragged him back, he saw his own reflection in the mirrors, his face pale and terrified, frozen in a scream. He knew he would never leave. The villagers reported hearing strange noises from the asylum that night, whispers that carried through the forest, the anguished wails of the souls trapped within. They knew another life had been lost to the asylum, another soul claimed by the shadows. To this day, Liechtenstein Asylum stands in silence, a dark reminder of the horrors within, and a prison for all who dare enter. And if you listen closely on a winter night, you can still hear the whispers of Elias calling out from the shadows, begging for release from the cursed walls of Liechtenstein Asylum. In the cold winter of 1834, an isolated asylum stood hidden deep within the forests of Ashbury, England. It was a forbidding stone building, a place shrouded in mystery and tales of horrors that no outsider dared confirm. This asylum, simply known as Ashbury Asylum, was infamous among the locals who whispered of strange noises and unearthly screams that filled the night air. Young Eloise Darby was only 19 when she was admitted to Ashbury Asylum by her family. They insisted it was for her own good, claiming she was prone to hysteria after the tragic death of her fiancé. In truth, Eloise had been hearing voices, faint whispers at first, but growing louder with each passing night. These voices called her name, beckoning her to join them. Her family assumed it was grief and arranged for her confinement in Ashbury, hoping she would be cured of her delusions. Eloise, pale and trembling, was led through the asylum's towering iron gates. The smell of decay filled the air, and she could hear faint murmurs, almost like whispers from invisible mouths. She glanced around nervously, but the staff, hardened by years of caring for the asylum's residents, paid her no mind. On her first night, Eloise was startled awake by a soft voice calling her name. Eloise. Eloise. It was no ordinary whisper. It was filled with a strange sadness, almost as if it were pleading with her. She sat up, her heart racing, and noticed a shadow flickering by the window. But when she approached, it was gone. The days that followed were worse. Every night the voices grew louder. They came not only from her cell but from down the hall, from empty rooms, and from the darkened corners where light dared not reach. Eloise was sure she wasn't alone. The spirits of those who had died within these walls seemed to haunt her. The nurses brushed off her fears, saying all new patients went through phases. But Eloise knew the truth. The asylum was alive with restless souls. One cold evening, Eloise met a fellow inmate, an elderly woman named Agnes. Agnes had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Her hair was thin and white, her eyes cloudy, but her voice was steady as she whispered a warning to Eloise. "They want you, my dear. The souls of Ashbury are trapped, but they will be free if they find a new body to take their place." Eloise was horrified. She didn't believe in possession or curses, but something about Agnes's words resonated. And as the whispers grew louder, Eloise's nightmares grew darker. She dreamt of shadowy figures crowding around her, their fingers reaching, eyes hollow and unblinking. In the dreams, they pleaded, "Free us. Let us go." The final straw came on the night of the full moon. Eloise woke to find herself surrounded by figures, pale, gaunt, and dressed in the tattered garments of former inmates. Their mouths were twisted in silent screams, and their eyes gleamed with desperation. Eloise tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. One of the apparitions, a young girl with sunken eyes, pointed a bony finger at Eloise's chest. "We can be free," she whispered, "but only if you join us." Eloise felt a cold sensation seeping into her skin, as though the spirits were draining her very life. She fell to her knees, clutching her chest, gasping for breath as the ghostly figures closed in. Their icy fingers wrapped around her, their whispers becoming louder, overwhelming her senses. And then, just as suddenly, they vanished. The next morning, the nurses found Eloise's lifeless body on the floor, her eyes wide open in terror, her lips frozen in a silent scream. The official report claimed she had suffered from a fatal heart attack. But the other patients knew better. They whispered that Eloise had been taken by the spirits of Ashbury Asylum, her soul now trapped within those stone walls, joining the chorus of whispers that haunted the night. From that day on, new residents of Ashbury reported hearing a new voice in the halls, a soft, sorrowful whisper calling out, "Help me. Let me go." But like the voices before her, Eloise's plea would forever echo, trapped within the asylum's haunted walls.